Now, WTCI presents One-on-One with your host, Victor Hogstrom.
And good evening. Welcome to another edition of One-on-One. I'm Victor Hogstrom. If you have a fax machine at the office, chances are you've run across the Chattanooga Fax. You may be a regular reader of this publication. It's news you don't always find in the mainstream media, and it seems to have gotten the attention of many around our community. Since its inception, the Chattanooga Fax has offered a conservative perspective to local and national stories. Tonight, I'm pleased to have Dean Arnold, publisher of the Chattanooga Fax, on One-on-One. Welcome to the program, Dean.
Glad to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Where did Dean Arnold come from to Chattanooga?
Well, I'm a native of California several generations back, but was raised in Roanoke, Virginia, and came here in 1982 to go to Covenant College. And after graduating, did a couple years in Florida, but came back here with some close friends. And I've really been here and have dug in and planted myself in the community the last 15 years. So that's how I got here.
Tell us about your family background.
Well, my father is actually a minister, a conservative minister, so that might connect some dots for some people. But my grandparents and great-grandparents were socialists and left-wingers, so I've got a kind of a interesting milieu.
And so tell us, how did this idea of the Chattanooga Fax come about? How did it all begin and why?
It began, I was, at the time, I was involved in a lot of political races. I was writing for a political think tank here in town, conservative think tank, and so many times I would want to see something come out in the newspaper that should have been in the paper related to a race or a cause or an action or a situation. And the story would either be slanted in a really bad direction, or it would just get spiked. They wouldn't run it at all. And you know, at some point you just think, you know, boy, it sure would be nice to have your own paper. Which is
who did not run the story?
The Times or the Free Press. There was two papers back then. Both of them. Particularly when it came to local issues. Back then, the Times was known to be more liberal, and the Free Press to be more conservative. But when it came to local issues, they seemed to kind of circle the wagons and have the same position, and would freeze out any differing local opinion on local issues. So I felt like it was necessary to have an alternative opinion. About that time when I was working with that think tank, we would get this fax in from Washington, actually from Gary Bauer's group. About 3 times a week, he'd send a little fax in, kind of the latest from Washington, D.C., which was very interesting. And I found myself, all of us in the office, sort of gravitating to the fax machine to get the hot news. And after about a year of that, I started to think, you know, there's something to this. There's a for-profit business in here somewhere. And the ideas started to turn. And then when I left that organization and was looking for the next thing to do, it was the time to try out that idea, and it worked.
And so you began writing all of these stories, but it was virtually on the from a very conservative perspective.
Yeah, when I started it out, I was more. I think I was still had on my conservative activist hat, and I still am an ideological conservative. But in the last 4 or 5 years of doing this, I've actually acquired a taste for professional journalism, and so that hat has changed somewhat. So I think the perspective now is more balanced than it was in the first year or two. I think the perspective is a little less strident, and there's an emphasis on trying to get at the truth.
So you're saying that it was not professional journalism in the beginning?
No, I wouldn't. Well, I would say it's more professional now. I think it was.
Now you're going for a balanced perspective.
I think perspective will always be with us, no matter how professional or objective you are.
Which interprets into bias, personal bias.
Yes, I mean,
right.
the perspective will always be there, and so I will always have a perspective that I bring to the news. But I do think that it needs to be dealt with wisely and with self-control. And I would say that in my first year or two, I didn't have as much of that. I think that there's more of that now.
But why didn't you? You were playing the role of a journalist. Why didn't you have that balance in the beginning?
You know, I think a lot of it, just to be honest with you, just has to do with personal maturity. And I think this relates to every part of your life, not if you're just a writer, But I think when you're younger, you're more of a hothead, you're more excited, you're more fired up, you run out, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And and so you want to make things happen, you want to change the world, you want to make a difference, and you don't have the wisdom of the years. Not that I have it yet, I got a long way to go, but I have more than I did. But you have more as you get older. You say, well, let's look into this a little bit. Let's get both sides of the story. Let's learn about this from all angles. Let's see if there's other ways we can go about solving this before we continue to move down the road. And I think older, wiser people do that in every area of life, and that includes journalism.
Now, was there any external force that caused you to change in that direction?
I think
any experience, anything that made you to sit up and take note?
I would say that there's probably a lot of answers to that, but I would say that first of all, just being involved with people who in stories that I covered, and seeing that it helps everyone, including the cause you're trying to put forth and the people you're covering, if you really search to get that truthful, balanced perspective. There's been some things that have happened with me in my life. I think we all go through times in our life that helps us to see the world in maybe a different way, a more mature way. That's probably added to all that.
What about threats? Did anyone threaten you? I remember some of those stories that I read in the facts in the beginning. They were really hard-hitting. Anyone threatened you, or?
No, actually, I may have gotten a couple of phone calls of people who didn't like the perspective, and they're not always liberal. There's been some conservatives. There's people out there who just get upset about things, and I think you talk to the Free Press, you talk to Rush Limbaugh. I mean, he's talked about this on the radio. Sometimes their most vicious people who write in letters or respond are people from the right, so it's not just the left. I've gotten just a few of that, just a little bit of that, not very much, I'll be honest with you. The people generally don't like to confront, so I've gotten just a little bit of that. But out in the public, talking to public figures, people who have been covered, maybe we've written some difficult stories about. When you're in public, everybody's friendly, very little, and that's sort of the nature of the public life and the nature of politics. It's actually kind of fascinating.
So let me ask you this question. Do you have any apologies that you want to make to anyone?
I don't think I would want to make specific apologies right now, but I can think of at least one public figure here who probably the first 3 months out, I ran a story about some things in his previous life that I didn't get his side of the story. I sourced some people from his hometown, and I never really pursued him to get his side of the story and to quote him. And I really regret that. I think it was a real professional mistake, and I've talked to him personally, and we've patched things up. But I think that was a mistake. I don't think I've made a mistake like that since. And I think in order to be fair and to be professional and to get at the truth, you've got to get everybody's side.
Yeah, that's so true. So now the paper, the Chattanooga Facts, has taken on a new direction, although not fully conservative, but now in a more balanced direction. What kind of feedback are you getting now?
Actually, a lot of good feedback. I think our reputation has grown quite a bit in the last couple of years in terms of journalistic integrity. I think we've been very blessed not to have made any really major factual errors in the 5-year history of the publication. And so people pretty much know that when it hits the Chattanooga Facts, it's reliable information. They might not always agree with the perspective. But I think an emphasis towards balance and emphasis towards getting at the truth has caused the larger part of the community, the more credible sides of the community, to be a little more interested. I do want to make a comment here. I am still very much a conservative. I think some of the phrases I've used in the past are a kinder, gentler conservative.
Sounds like someone we know.
That's one I've used, or a kinder, gentler muckraker is a funnier one to say. And also, I would say that still very committed to the absolutes of right and wrong that are sort of the underpinnings of a conservative perspective, but not as not as vehement about my own ability to do everything right, therefore not as taxing on everyone else to do everything exactly right, but still striving towards that ideal.
So tell us about some of the latest stories that you've been publishing in the facts, and how could one get the facts if you're not at a business? Why only directed to businesses, I guess is the question.
Oh, it's not directed towards businesses. Anybody who wants to get it can get it. It's if you want to sign up, call 517-8-FAX, and there's an opportunity there to leave a voicemail, to leave your fax machine. You can also get it by email. We send out 1,500 emails every week. We send out 8,500 faxes every week. But no, it goes to businesses, individuals, anybody who has a fax machine. We'll be happy to send it to.
So how does the fax support itself financially? How does it work?
We're advertising driven. It's a free publication, and advertisers who want to get their name out pay money.
Now, your background, let's come back to that for a moment. Were you working in the media, mainstream media, before you began changing over to your own publication?
No, I actually never had a media gig before this one. I was a writer. I did a lot of political activity, did a lot of political writing, press releases, public relations type of things, and I did a lot of philosophical and theological type of writing too. So it was a pretty easy transition to make.
So tell us about, in your assessment, the impact that your work, the facts, has had on this community.
Well, I would like to think that a differing or alternative print medium in town has made quite a bit of difference. I don't think, as a smaller publication, you can have the kind of impact that a newspaper can have on a broad level. There's just no way. But I do think that we've made a difference in some areas. I think that some of our involvement with watchdogging education and some of the insistence that there be a budget and a line item budget and see exactly where all the money's spent, that sort of thing. I believe our publication printed a lot of stories about that the paper wouldn't print. And I think that made a difference in town. I think in the whole water company takeover saga, we printed a lot of stories there that the paper didn't print. So I think that made a difference. And I think we've done a lot of stories on questionable issues regarding toxic dumping and pollution problems in Chattanooga that haven't hit the media, I think in large part because there's a sincere effort by the powers that be to portray Chattanooga as the environmental city and having everything together, and I think we can be that, and we are that in some ways, but I think there's some things that need to be cleaned up that need to be talked about, so I think we've made a difference there.
Now, you brought up two items that we'd like to pursue. One of them is about education, and the other is about the city water issue that the mayor resolved. But you came to the forefront in opposition of schools merger, the Hamilton County and City of Chattanooga school systems being merged into one system. You were on television being interviewed, you were faxing information on Chattanooga Fax. Why were you so opposed to the merger?
I was opposed to the merger because I felt like there was, at the time I was working at the Chattanooga Resource Foundation here in town, which is a great organization, and two of the things that we were really involved in at that point were more of a Judeo-Christian type of emphasis in terms of the community and in education, and also a real push towards racial reconciliation in the community, Christians, black and white, coming together, and the merger did a couple of things. One, it had introduced a plan from the Public Education Foundation that was really ended up being just a huge womb to tomb, in my opinion, kind of a socialistic vision for Chattanooga, and I didn't think that was good at all. And then it was also, the merger was something that the black community was very much upset about, felt like it was disenfranchisement or a disempowering of their autonomy in the community. And I agree with both of those. I didn't like Superintendent Reynolds. I didn't think he had done a very good job, and I felt like the city school leadership needed to have its house cleaned. Nevertheless, I don't think the way you solve it was to dissolve the city schools and dissolve the city citizens' autonomy and ability to rule themselves, so to speak. So I was very much for both those issues, and I felt like it was a good fit for someone like me to try to be involved in keeping that from happening. I always believe that smaller school systems, smaller schools, more parental involvement, more community involvement will always, in the long run, produce better education than a large scheme. And I think that's borne itself out. People would disagree with that, but that is why I got involved in it, and I'm glad I did.
Well, your attempts did not work. They were not successful in preventing the merger. It happened.
Yes.
Now your assessment.
Well, one of the things we made a lot of hay about in that merger campaign was that it was going to cost. Supposedly we were merging to get rid of central office bureaucracy and scale down and run a more efficient, lean machine, but they ended up costing. Then they came out and said, well, the merger is going to cost $25 million. And so we made a lot of hay about that. So when they actually merged, they weren't able to raise taxes as high as they wanted to. So I think we made a difference on that. I think they did raise taxes some. And I think, we've got 4 or 5 schools in the inner city that are the lowest in the state of Tennessee, and I think that's a problem. But I don't want to be too hard on the powers that be in the public school system, because that's a hard job. We do have public education. It's part of the Constitution of the state of Tennessee, and we need to have as good a public education as we can. And so I support them, and I encourage them to do the best job they can, but it's very difficult. And I would say, honestly, I think that Jesse Register and others would have an easier time if they were running smaller school systems, if they were running 3 or 4 smaller school systems in this area as opposed to one large one. But that's water under the bridge. We've got the big one now. Let's do the best we can.
And the other issue you mentioned was about the city water system. You sued the city to get those documents that were being protected. You're pretty courageous, I might add. Why? Of all persons, why Dane Arnold?
Well, what had happened at that point in time is John Kinsey had told the newspaper, he'd told county commissioners and others that he was not going to disclose the documents. And after seeing that for a week or two, I just got kind of angry about it personally, because we've got several hundred years of freedoms in the West that are directly related to governments disclosing their activities and public officials conducting their meetings in public, and things that are funded by taxpayers' dollars being open and honest and above board. So no matter what anybody says, when you've got those kind of fundamental constitutional rights behind you, a mayor or a public official can't just say no. And really, one of the other folks should have sued. The newspapers should have filed a lawsuit. The TV stations should have, and they didn't. So I stepped up to the plate and filed a lawsuit, and we won.
And did you find anything that was did you find anything in the document that you did not expect to see?
Well, when we finally got the document, I had some pretty high-leveled financial experts in town evaluate it, and the analysis was that it was far too skimpy a document to give any information on whether or not to take over a $100 million or $200 million company or whatever it was, or $1 billion or whatever the assessment is. And so it's possible that the motivation for not disclosing it is that when Mayor Kinsey was saying this document justifies why we're going to take over the water company, if he'd actually disclosed it, then financial minds would have said, well, that's just not nearly enough information. We need more than that. So that may have been the motive for why they didn't disclose it.
Okay, let's come back to you now. You seem to be very courageous, as I said, and very outgoing in what you want and in what you're trying to achieve. So tell me about Dane Arnold, the person, and what makes you tick? Well,
that's a good question. I think I'm some people have called me the Matt Drudge of Chattanooga. And I think maybe for right now that's a little bit true. But I'm really not at heart an investigative journalist. I think I'm really more of an enterprising, networking kind of a person. And I think you'll see me being involved in more and more types of projects, more types of enterprises and things on both a...
I know you're involved in the jazz operation here.
Yeah, about a year ago I founded the Big Nine Jazz Association, and we're doing some things there, and I've enjoyed that. So you'll see me involved in other business enterprises, maybe some other media things, public relations events, and artistic kind of venues, and the Chattanooga Facts will continue, but hopefully I'll be able to make enough money to hire some other people to run that, and I won't be as much involved. So yes, Dean Arnold as the person is more of an enterpriser, and the reporting hat and the activist hat comes on and off.
How is the question? How does Dean Arnold make a living? Where's his source of income? From the Facts?
Yeah, Chattanooga Facts is my sole source of income. It's advertising driven, and that pays the bills. I'm not getting rich, but I have a real good opportunity right now to spend time making a difference in the community in a venue that is fairly influential.
So if you were to think back in your life so far, and you're fairly young, if there's one thing you would like to change in your life, what would it be?
What would it be? I would say, I mean, that's a tough question.
Oh, you can answer that.
I don't know if I've lived long enough to answer that question, but I'm actually fairly comfortable with the steps I've made to this point. I've taken some risks, and won a couple, lost a couple, but I'm pretty comfortable where I am at this point, and thankful for how things have developed.
Who's been your greatest influence in your life, or what has been your greatest influence?
Probably, I've got my father made a pretty large impact on me, and I have an older brother who's a pretty enterprising guy in Nashville. And I think both of them have probably had a pretty strong influence on me in terms of who I am today. But there's been a lot of influence. Covenant College was a real serious influence. That's a fantastic institution. Frank Brock, the president there, is a personal friend who made a large impact on me. So there's been a number of people.
Now, what about your future goals? Your goals personally and your goals for the Chattanooga Facts?
Goals for the Chattanooga Facts are to be a continually thriving, growing media organization that continues to branch out in the various areas of technology that are developing, and to continue to provide an alternative, healthy, fresh print opinion in town, or print perspective. And I think personally, I've always had, behind the Chattanooga Facts and behind the various things I've done, I've always had a love for Chattanooga. In fact, I moved here with some friends. We wanted to make a difference in the city, and this was 15, 16 years ago. And that passion still lies deep within me, just to make a difference in Chattanooga and make it a better place. You know, sometimes there's the old phrase, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. And I'd like to think that's been part of some of the difficult messages I've brought to the community in the past. But it is the ulterior motive behind that really is to make things better. So I want to be more involved in the community, and that may take various forms.
So you want to get involved, you want to help make Chattanooga a better place. How do you rate Chattanooga right now as it stands?
Chattanooga's got a lot going for it. Chattanooga's in a very interesting time. It's an exciting time to be in Chattanooga. One of the things that really defines Chattanooga, you know, there's various things. I'm a student of the history of Chattanooga. And Chattanooga has a very strong religious kind of Christian emphasis in its history. But it also, you can't understand Chattanooga without understanding big money and long established, really quite interesting, impressive families with a lot of money, a lot of it related to the Koch money, but there's other kind of dynasties here in town. That whole phenomenon is changing. It's been changing for about 10 years, and it's in the next 5 or 10 years it'll be a fairly complete transition where the heads of those families aren't so much making the decisions in town as say 20, 25 people Now it's going to be more like 200, 300 folks who are involved in, someone who came from out of town to run the company that was publicly sold, or someone who runs a Chamber of Commerce who's not from Chattanooga, and a lot of things like that are going on. So this is a real interesting time in Chattanooga to get involved, and you don't have to have a particular last name or have to have grown up on Lookout Mountain or Signal Mountain anymore to make a real difference in Chattanooga. And I think the people who live on Lookout Mountain, excuse me, are just as excited about that as everyone else is. And so it's an exciting development and an exciting time.
Political outlook for Dane Arnold. Are you interested in running for some office in the future?
You know, I've thought about that, and it's been something that's been in the back of my mind. Not in the near future, I'll tell you that. I don't have an interest in that. There's a lot of things you can do when you're not a public official that can make a real difference. And right now, I'm just really comfortable with that, and I might find myself in that position for the rest of my life. But you never know. Some opportunity may come knocking on the door. But right now, I'm real comfortable with where I am.
Now, we have several people running for mayor. In the group, what are your picks? Who's going to be the mayor, and why?
Well, I'd say I don't think there's much question at this point that Bob Corker is the front runner, and I think he'd make a fine mayor. We'll make an endorsement in our publication, and then if I had to make the endorsement today, I would endorse Corker, but we still got a campaign to work through. But I think there's likely to be a runoff, but there still may not be because Corker's going to have such a strong campaign. Overton will probably be the second person involved, and then you've got probably Rutherford and Wolf. Excuse me. Rutherford and Wolf are probably going to be head-to-head, and David Crockett behind there somewhere. So it'll be an interesting race, but it's a good race for Chattanooga.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much. Glad to be on the show.
And thank you for watching One-on-One this evening. We appreciate Dane Arnold joining us. Whether you agree with him or not, his candor and honesty are refreshing. Join me again next time for another edition of One-on-One. I'm Victor Hawkstrom. Good night.